Hey everyone, and welcome back to our Crazy Day with Cobras reading. Now, I was looking at the table of contents and I noticed there are 12 chapters in this book, but we don't have that many days of school left. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read 2 chapters a day until we're done. So, we're on chapter 3 today, and we ended chapter 4 with Jack and Annie about to tell Lagarde what gift they brought for the Great Mogul in order to be let into the Red Fort as ambassadors. So, let's see what happens. Chapter 3 is called Complete Respect. Very good, the guard said. The Great Mogul eagerly awaits your arrival, and your treasure. What treasure? Thought Jack. What is Annie talking about? You may pass through the gate, said the guard. Follow the other ambassadors to the hall of public audience where the Great Mogul appears each morning before his court nobles. Thanks, said Annie. She pulled Jack along toward the drawbridge. And don't worry, the guard called after them. The Great Mogul will not mind your youth. His grandfather became emperor when he was 13. Great, thanks, Annie called back. Hey, what were you talking about back there? Jack whispered as he and Annie started across the bridge. We didn't bring any treasure for the Great Mogul. We didn't bring anything. Yes, we did, said Annie. What? Tell me what, said Jack. Your story, said Annie. It's in your bag, right? You've got to be kidding, said Jack. That's not treasure. Yes, it is. Think about it. You printed your story in fancy curly type from the computer, right? I did my drawings with sparkle pens. There were no computers or sparkle pens 400 years ago. The Great Mogul has never seen writing and artwork like that. Our ordinary stuff will be treasure in his time. I don't know. Jack didn't know what to think. He just shook his head. It would be, trust me, said Annie. And hurry, we don't want to lose the other ambassadors. She ran to the entrance of the Red Fort. Jack followed her. They passed through a gateway that opened to a stone road. The road led to a large square. At the opposite side of the square was a long, low building with columns and arches. There they are, said Annie. She pointed to the ambassadors' ox carts rolling toward the building. That must be the hall of public audience, said Jack. Jack and Annie walked quickly toward the building. The air felt as if it were coming from a hot furnace. By the time they arrived at the hall, Jack felt faint from the heat. The ambassadors from Europe had already gone inside. Fierce-looking guards stood at the entrances. Daggers and curved swords hung from their belts. Annie walked up to one of the burly guards. Excuse me, she said in a low voice, but we are ambassadors from Frog Creek, and we are supposed to be with those other ambassadors. To Jack's surprise, the guard asked no questions. He nodded and gestured for them to follow him. Annie and Jack followed the guard into the shadowy hall. The air inside was much cooler. It smelled of roses and mint. Hidden musicians played soft music. The burly guard escorted Jack and Annie past the audience of court nobles. All the men had beards or mustaches and wore beautiful coats of many colors and patterns. Bright orange, purple, turquoise, green striped, and pale pink with flowers. Next to the nobles, the 8 ambassadors from Europe stood along a silver railing. They were lined up in pairs. The burly guard ushered Jack and Annie to the end of the line. Everyone in the hall was facing a high platform with wide steps. The platform was made of sparkling diamonds, emeralds, and pearls. Gold columns supported a golden canopy above the platform. Statues of 2 jeweled peacocks with rubies in their beaks were perched above the canopy. Over the golden canopy was another canopy of rich cloth. Tall, thin candlesticks held flickering candles, and servants sprayed rose-scented water into the air. As Annie looked around at everything, Jack slipped their book out of his bag. He huddled over it and read it to himself. Every morning, the Great Mogul sat on his peacock throne in the hall of public audience. He demanded complete respect. Everyone had to be perfectly still and silent in his presence. No one was allowed to sit or leave as long as he was in the hall. If his guests spoke to him without permission or did not bow the proper way, he could have them killed. Oh man, thought Jack. He shoved the book back into his bag and turned to Annie. Don't speak, he whispered, and we have to bow the proper way. Don't worry, we learned how to bow in the palace in Vienna, said Annie. No, this is different, whispered Jack. When I messed up there, people just laughed. Here, they kill you. Oh, well, don't forget, we've got our potion from Kathleen, she whispered. If worse comes to worse, we can make ourselves small and escape. Forget it, Jack whispered. I don't want to be a tiny little person. The guards will just chase us down and squash us like bugs. Annie laughed. This isn't funny, said Jack. Let's go back outside and make another plan. We don't know what we're doing here. Yes, we do, Annie said. We're going to give your story to the Great Mogul, and then we're going to ask him for an emerald rose. Simple. No, said Jack. I told you, we can't say a word to him, not a word. Come on, we have to leave while we're still alive. Annie sighed. Okay, fine, she said. But as Jack and Annie turned to go, trumpet blasts shattered the air. The trumpet sounds were followed by deafening drum rolls. Shah Jahan, the Great Mogul of India, stepped through a door at the back of the hall. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is titled The Great Mogul. Jack and Annie froze. The hall was completely still and silent. The Great Mogul climbed the steps to the peacock throne. He wore an orange turban and a silver coat trimmed with diamonds and pearls. He wore ropes of jewels around his neck and sparkling rings on his fingers. The Great Mogul sat cross-legged on a cushion and looked coldly at his audience. He had a handsome face with a sharp nose and dark, distant eyes. A servant stood near him, waving a large peacock feather fan. Another waved a broom to shoo away flies. An imperial guard escorted a pair of European ambassadors to the wide steps that led to the throne. Jack and Annie watched carefully as the ambassadors stood before the Great Mogul. The two men bowed from their waists and brushed the back of their right hands over the carpet. They straightened up, raised their right hands into the air, and placed their palms on top of their heads. Then they lowered their hands and stood very still. So that's the way to bow before a Great Mogul, thought Jack. He hoped he and Annie could remember how to do it. One of the ambassadors then opened a bag and pulled out a jewel-studded crown and a golden goblet. He gave them to the Great Mogul. The ruler looked at the glittering gifts. Without smiling, he handed them to a servant who had appeared beside him. Another servant stepped forward with the silver tray. On the tray was a red satin pillow. Spread across the pillow were dozens of glittering jewels. The ambassadors selected several precious gems, then turned and walked slowly down the steps of the throne. Annie nudged Jack. He looked at her, and she smiled. He knew just what she was thinking. Those guys got jewels without saying a word. But Jack was still worried. An emerald rose wasn't an ordinary jewel. Plus, his story seemed like such a teeny gift compared to a crown and a golden goblet. The other ambassadors climbed the peacock throne in pairs. They all bowed the same way. They all opened their bags and gave gifts to the Great Mogul. A carved wooden clock, a crystal necklace, a gleaming silver sword. As the ruler received each exquisite gift, he never changed his expression. Jack grew more and more anxious. If the Great Mogul seemed bored with these treasures, what would he think of a kid's story? All the ambassadors from Europe were offered jewels from the silver tray. Then they resumed their place in line. Finally, an imperial guard beckoned to Jack and Annie. It was their turn. Jack's legs felt wobbly as he walked with Annie up the steps of the throne. The Great Mogul looked at them with his distant, cold stare. Together, Jack and Annie bowed from their waists. They brushed the back of their right hands over the carpet. They stood up and raised their right hands into the air. They placed their palms on top of their heads. Jack held his breath the whole time. A fly landed on his nose, but he didn't flinch. Jack and Annie lowered their arms. Jack's hands were shaky as he unbuckled his bag and pulled out his story. Without a word, he handed it to the Great Mogul. The ruler stared at the first page. Slowly, he ran his fingers over the fancy type. He turned the page and stared at Annie's sparkly drawing of the treehouse in the Frog Creek woods. Again, he touched the page. Then the Great Mogul raised his eyes and looked straight at Jack and Annie. The next thing Jack knew, a servant was standing in front of them with a tray of jewels. In a panic, Jack stared at the pile of diamonds, pearls, and red, green, and yellow gems. The jewels were all cut in different shapes. Emerald rose, Jack thought wildly. He tried to focus, but the glittering gems swirled in front of his eyes. Flowers, fish, stars, birds, butterflies, pears, and apples, but no emerald rose. When Jack glanced up, he saw the Great Mogul watching him. Jack was ready to grab anything. Annie reached forward and carefully picked up a green stone. She solemnly showed it to Jack. It was a small emerald shaped like a rose. Jack nodded, trying to appear calm. His heart was pounding. He glanced at the Great Mogul. The ruler was looking at them with interest. He seemed about to say something, but then a guard beckoned for Jack and Annie to leave the throne platform. Jack and Annie climbed down the steps and returned to their places behind the other ambassadors. Wow, 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 Jack thought. We did it! The Great Mogul stood up from his cushion. Quickly and quietly, he walked down the steps of the peacock throne. No one moved as the all-powerful ruler slipped out of the hall. The whole audience seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Everyone began talking and moving about. The guard stepped forward to escort the ambassadors through the door at the back of the hall. "Come on, let's get out of here," Jack whispered to Annie. He pulled her away from the other ambassadors, and they joined the stream of court nobles heading toward the doors at the front of the hall. "Mission accomplished," Annie exclaimed. She handed Jack the emerald rose. Jack stared at the delicately cut stone. It had 5 tiny rose petals that curled back at the edges. "Great work," he said to Annie. He carefully put the jewel in his bag and buckled it. "I was wrong. You were right." "I won't rub it in," Annie said with a grin. "That's okay. I deserve it," Jack said. "I shouldn't have worried so much. Now we just have to get back to the treehouse. Keep your head down. Move quickly." Jack and Annie wound their way through the crowd, heading for the front doors. Just as they were about to step into the sunlight, another guard blocked their way. "Excuse us," said Jack. He tried to step around the guard who towered over them, but the guard put out his large hand. "I will escort you now to the palace," he said, "to the private balcony of the Great Mogul." Why?" Jack asked. "All the ambassadors are to view a parade in their honor," said the guard. "Parade?" said Annie. "I love parades." But we're kind of in a hurry. Do we have a choice?" Jack asked. "No," said the guard. "Oh," said Jack. "Okay." "This way," said the guard. Jack and Annie walked after him through the empty hall. "Don't worry," Annie whispered to Jack. "What could possibly go wrong at a parade?" I wonder just exactly what will go wrong at that parade. Those are famous last words. So, I will have chapter 5 ready for you tomorrow. 5 and 6 tomorrow. Thank you for joining me, and have a great evening. Bye!